Have you ever stopped to consider whether everything we know about identity is truly reliable? Well, before we get into this story, I want to ask you, have you subscribed to the channel yet? If not, take advantage now. That way you'll help me continue bringing you investigations no one else dares to report. Also, leave a like and comment with your thoughts, because every detail here can completely change the way you see the world. Today's case, the case of the two victims, is one that defies even the most logical mind. Imagine the scene: two identical bodies found in the same place, side by side, but with only one missing person report. It doesn't make sense, does it? And that's precisely why I delved into this mystery. Because when logic fails, it's a sign we're dealing with something extraordinary. Prepare for an investigation filled with enigmas, moral dilemmas, and seemingly impossible twists. With each clue, a new question arises. With each answer, a new enigma unfolds. You'll feel like you're not just listening to a story, but participating in it with me, deciphering step by step one of the greatest paradoxes I've ever faced. And believe me, the deeper we delve into this case, the more you'll realize that the truth isn't what it seems. So, if you're ready to use your logic, test your intuition, and question everything you believe about identity, come with me, because the mystery of the two victims is about to begin. I'll never forget the first time I stepped onto that abandoned lot. The early morning chills seemed to cut me to the core, but that wasn't what took my breath away. Before me, two bodies stretched out side by side, so similar that anyone would have thought they were twins, but I knew it wasn't that simple. I'd seen it all in my career, but this was different. The forensic experts were perplexed. One of them, experienced as few others, said to me in a low voice, "John, I don't know how to explain this. It's like we're looking at the same person twice." It echoed in my mind like an unsolvable riddle. I've faced criminals who tried to manipulate evidence. I've seen scenes designed to confuse, but there was something beyond the human, something that touched on the improbable. As I observed the details, I noticed small discrepancies. A scar on one body that wasn't on the other, slightly different skin tone, but nothing that justified the feeling that they were identical. It was as if logic had been turned upside down before my eyes. And believe me, when logic seems to fail, that's when the most dangerous truth often hides. At that moment, I took a deep breath and thought, if there are two versions of the same victim, then the question isn't just who killed, but which of them actually lived. And it's in these kinds of gaps that a good investigator learns to look. What seemed like the beginning of an unusual case actually turned out to be the harbinger of something much bigger. And little did I know that the next detail found at the scene would raise even more questions than it answered. At the police station, the buzz continued. Two identical bodies lay on the autopsy table, but only one police report was filed. It's as if mathematics had decided to play with our logic. 2 minus 1 didn't yield any result. I've always believed that every detail counts, but I confess that this time I felt as if the case had already begun by mocking my experience. I pulled up the files and confirmed. Only one person had been officially declared missing. There were no other records, no clues to a second victim, nothing. It was as if one of them had appeared out of nowhere, just to confuse the situation. And it was at that moment that I realized, more dangerous than a well-planned crime is one that defies our most basic understanding. I talked to some colleagues and realized that many preferred to believe in coincidence. But for me, coincidence is just a lazy excuse for those who don't want to dig deeper. I've learned over the years that behind every freak accident there's almost always a calculating mind. And in this case, someone was playing with the very notion of identity. The most intriguing thing is that the more I reflected on this paradox, the more questions arose. If only one person had disappeared, who was the other? Were we facing an imposter, a hoax, or something even more complex? It felt like the answer was hiding just behind a door, but I still didn't know which key to turn first. When the fingerprint results came back, even the most skeptical members of the team gasped. The two bodies, despite being side by side at the same scene, shared the same identity. The system left no room for doubt. It was the same name, the same record, the same history. I've never seen anything like it. And I can assure you, if there's one thing that can disarm a veteran investigator, it's when science and logic seem to conspire against reality. I looked at those reports as if facing a riddle written in an unknown language. Because you see, It's not just about duplication of paperwork, but about something physical, tangible, something you can touch. How could I explain two bodies with the same biological signature? It was as if nature itself had short-circuited, and deep down I began to sense that this was no ordinary crime, but a calculated message. I recalled past cases where criminals forged fingerprints using primitive techniques, such as silicone molds. But this wasn't the case. Both bodies displayed authentic, natural, perfect prints, and there was no sign of tampering. In other words, if it was fraud, it was so sophisticated that it surpassed any previously recorded standard. With each detail, the situation became more ominous. After all, if both men's identities were the same, which one was the real victim? And even worse, which one shouldn't even exist? It was at this point that I realized I was dealing with something that would take me far beyond the realm of ordinary crimes, toward a mystery capable of rewriting the very rules of investigation. Receiving the DNA report was like being punched in the gut. I expected contradictions, but not to this extent. The two bodies, according to science, were absolutely identical in their genetic makeup. Technically, they were the same person. Yet, when we looked at the visible details, something didn't add up. Scars that existed on one didn't appear on the other. Teeth with different treatments, even small calluses on the hands told different stories. It was as if life had shaped each of us differently, even though we had the same biological foundation. And this made me reflect. Identity isn't just in DNA, but in the sum of our accumulated experiences. A simple childhood scratch, a surgery, a bicycle accident, all of these things set us apart. So how can we explain how two equals could bear the marks of such divergent trajectories? I spoke to the coroner and realized that even he wasn't at a loss for words. He was a cold man, accustomed to corpses, but that night his gaze trembled. "John, this doesn't make sense. They're the same person, but they lived different lives." That sentence echoed within me, because if that were true, I wasn't just investigating a murder, but also an existential paradox. And it was at that point that doubt turned into obsession. I knew that behind this duplicity lay a hidden truth, something someone had long tried to hide. But like every poorly buried secret, sooner or later it resurfaces. And at that moment I was certain that the next step in the investigation would open an even deeper wound. When the family entered the morgue, the silence was almost unbearable. I had seen relatives recognize victims many times, but never had I witnessed something so disturbing. The mother, tears in her eyes, stared at the two bodies as if facing a nightmare with no escape. She pointed out details, first in one, then in the other, unable to decide which one was, in fact, her son. The older brother, on the other hand, swore the body on the left bore the same birthmark he remembered from childhood. The aunt insisted the other had the mark on his eyebrow caused by a bicycle fall. It was as if the family's own memory had fragmented into two conflicting versions of the same life. I watched it all and wondered, if even those I loved most couldn't tell the difference, how could the truth emerge? The most intriguing thing was noticing the looks exchanged between the relatives. It wasn't just pain, there was also a silent fear, as if some knew more than they were willing to say. I've learned in years of investigation that often a family's silence speaks louder than any testimony. And that night I realized there was a hidden story, perhaps hidden for decades, about to be revealed. With every word the family members spoke, a new question arose. Who had they really lost? Were they both part of a secret the family itself had tried to bury? I felt like I was only scratching the surface of something much bigger. And like any puzzle, the more impossible it seemed, the more I knew I needed to dig deeper. Because the next detail would come along to further confuse the puzzle. I reached a point where logic seemed to abandon me. I looked at those two bodies and the question lingered in my mind. Which one was the real missing person? Or did neither match the official record? In investigations, I often say that when the answer doesn't fit, it's because we're asking the wrong question. And this time I felt the central question wasn't who died, but rather who really existed. I revisited the missing person report. The family's description was accurate, but not definitive. Small details, like the type of clothing worn on the day of the disappearance, were lost in contradictory versions. This made me wonder, could someone have been manipulating the case from the beginning? Throughout my career, I've learned that the first clue is rarely the most reliable. Often it's just the bait left to guide the investigator away from the truth. The doubt grew like a shadow. What if they were both just pieces in a larger game? Two copies of the same story, purposefully planted to create confusion. The idea seemed absurd, but absurdities have a habit of becoming reality when it comes to elaborate crimes. It wouldn't be the first time I'd encountered minds capable of devising enigmas simply to prove their intellectual superiority. As I reflected on this, I remembered an important detail. In enigmas, the key is almost never in what's obvious. Often it's in what's not visible, in the empty space that the truth hides. And in this case, the absence of a second disappearance report could be precisely the clue that points to something even more disturbing. I just didn't imagine that the next chapter of this puzzle would lead me straight to the city's dark past. It was during a rainy night, rummaging through old files in the police station basement, that I stumbled upon a forgotten clue. Yellowed newspapers, dated more than 20 years ago, carried headlines the town preferred to forget. Local lab scandal, scientists investigated for illegal practices. The article spoke of genetic experiments, unauthorized tests, and a word that until then had seemed like science fiction: cloning. At that moment, the case took on even more opaque tones. The scandal, at the time, involved renowned doctors, influential politicians, and even local businessmen. Everything was hushed up over time, and those involved never faced justice. The public believed it was merely media exaggeration, a rumor without concrete evidence. But the documents I had in my hands told a very different story. There was evidence that experiments were actually carried out, not just planned. As I read each line, I realized that what lay before me was not just a recent crime, but the echo of something that began decades ago. I've learned throughout my life that the secrets we try to bury eventually find a way to resurface. And in that moment, I began to connect the dots. Perhaps those two identical bodies weren't a coincidence, but the direct consequence of something that began in that shadowy laboratory. This revelation opened the door to a new line of investigation. If the city's past held such dark secrets, the present was merely the continuation of that unresolved story. I knew I needed to dig deeper, because if there truly was a link between cloning and those victims, then we were about to enter territory where science and crime intertwine in a way that's nearly impossible to unravel. And that was exactly what I would discover in the next step. Following the trail blazed by old newspapers, I made my way to the site of the laboratory. Today, the building is nothing more than an abandoned skeleton, with broken windows and graffiti-covered walls. But as I walked through those dusty corridors, I felt the silence held more stories than any official archive. It was there that, according to contemporary records, genetic experiments had taken place that challenged not only ethics, but also the very notion of humanity. Internal documents I obtained through a reliable source revealed disturbing details. There were reports on large-scale cell replication attempts, notes on tissue development, and in some cases, vague descriptions of unexpected results. Most frighteningly, many of these files were purposefully redacted, as if someone had tried to erase the past at any cost. To me, this is never a sign of innocence, but of a cover-up. I spoke with former employees from that time, and although few were willing to talk, one of them said something I can't forget. "John, they were playing God. And when someone plays God, the price always comes sooner or later." Those words stuck with me because they seemed to perfectly sum up what I was about to face in that case. The link between that laboratory and the two identical bodies was beginning to become inescapable. It was as if I had found the central piece of a puzzle that until then had seemed impossible to put together. But I knew that if there truly was a connection, the most dangerous part was still missing: discovering who, today, inherited the dark legacy of those experiments. And that answer would soon be revealed. Not long before the case, previously confined to the police station, exploded into the news. Headlines featured photos of me arriving at the crime scene, accompanied by questions that sounded more like a science fiction script than journalism. Two identical bodies, proof of human cloning. The media loves to turn mystery into spectacle, and I knew this would put even more pressure on the investigation. The problem is that when public opinion enters the picture, the truth often gets lost in the noise. Some sensationalist programs screamed that this was the first evidence of clones on Brazilian soil. Others, more conservative, ridiculed the idea, calling it mass hysteria. Amidst this crossfire, what really mattered, the victims, began to be overshadowed by the media circus. But I confess that silently, A legitimate doubt also gnawed at me. It wasn't the first time I'd seen science intermingle with shady interests, and although I'd always believed human cloning was a distant prospect, those two bodies stared back at me as concrete proof that perhaps we were closer to that abyss than we'd like to admit. Each expert interview on television only heightened public curiosity. Some said it was impossible, others that sufficient technology already existed to accomplish such a feat. And there, in the midst of the storm, I knew the truth wouldn't be revealed in public debates, but in cold, silent clues, hidden in corners where few dare look. It was then that a forgotten detail tightened to catch my attention. While everyone was busy discussing cloning, genetics, and conspiracies, I focused on something much simpler: a ring. On one of the bodies, I found an antique family heirloom, with initials engraved inside. To most investigators, it might just be a common accessory, but I've learned my whole life that the most banal details are precisely those that carry the most weighty truth. I called the victim's mother to confirm. When her eyes fell on the ring, she couldn't hold back her tears. She said it had been passed down from generation to generation, and that her son never took it off his finger, not even to sleep. Her reaction was so visceral that there was no room for doubt. At least one of the bodies carried an authentic fragment of the missing victim's life. But the question became even more disturbing. If only one of them wore the ring, what about the other? Were we looking at someone who lived without ties, without memories, without roots? A being who, despite carrying the same DNA, didn't share the same story. The idea sent a chill down my spine, because identity isn't just genetics. It's also memory, connection, belonging. This small detail opened a huge crack in the investigation. The ring not only indicated who had lived the real life, but also revealed that the other body was an unknown quantity with no clear past. And deep down, I knew discovering who this second being was could be the key to unlocking an even more dangerous enigma. At first, the police tried to pursue the simplest path: identity theft. After all, we've seen skilled criminals forge documents, tamper with civil records, and even create entire personas from well-crafted lies. It would be logical to assume that one of the bodies was simply an imposter. But with each new scientific test, this theory crumbled as quickly as it had been proposed. The fingerprints were identical. DNA tests reinforced the impossible match. And not even the most skeptical expert could support the hypothesis of a common fraud. Frustration gripped the team, because when a line of investigation collapses, the void that remains is often even more frightening. And I knew that it was in this space of uncertainty that the darkest secrets often hide. The truth is, the case was already slipping beyond the bounds of a traditional police investigation. It was like trying to solve a puzzle where half the pieces came from another box. And no matter how hard we tried to fit the narrative of a fraud together, science itself pushed us to accept that there was something bigger going on. Something that defied established logic and that few were willing to face. It was at this point that I decided to change my approach. If there was no way to explain it through conventional means, I would have to look in less obvious territories. It was no longer just about finding a culprit, but about understanding a phenomenon. And believe me, when an investigator realizes that the game has changed, it's a sign that the next clue won't just surprise. It will also shake certainties that previously seemed unshakable. When the autopsy reports arrived, I thought I'd finally have a concrete answer. But instead, the mystery only deepened. The test showed that the two bodies didn't die at exactly the same moment. There was a difference of a few hours between them. A small detail, but enough to turn logic upside down. After all, how can one explain two deaths so close in time, yet so connected? This temporal discrepancy opened the door to new hypotheses. Could one have been eliminated first, and the other killed soon after to cover up something bigger? Or were we facing a cold calculation, a criminal timeline planned with almost surgical precision? For me, time was not just a clinical fact, but a silent message left by the author of this enigma. I remember an old professor who said, "John, in investigations, time is always the most treacherous piece. It can be both an accomplice and a whistleblower." In this case, the gap in hours was no coincidence. It was a trace, perhaps the most revealing of all, because it meant someone had been present at the scene for longer than they'd like to admit. With each minute I reflected on this difference, the clearer the feeling became that it wasn't a coincidence. Someone intended for two deaths, close enough to seem simultaneous, yet far enough apart to confuse us. And like any well-crafted trick, the goal was to distract us from what really mattered. I just didn't know that the next detail would be even more disturbing than time itself. As I examined the reports more closely, something jumped out at me. Only one of the bodies bore obvious signs of a struggle. Scratches on the arms, fresh bruises, even signs of desperate resistance. The other, in contrast, seemed to have simply passed out, without a single hint of violence. It was as if one had waged a fierce battle for his life, while the other had silently surrendered to fate. This disparity opened up a new field of questions. Were there two distinct forms of execution, a brutal murder and a clean death, planned to leave no trace? Or worse yet, did only one of them know they were in danger, while the other didn't even have time to realize it? The scene was beginning to look less like a common crime and more like a meticulously orchestrated staged act. I recalled past investigations in which criminals used selective violence as a message. Struggle marks can reveal who the primary target was, or even who posed a real threat to the culprit. In this case, the difference between the bodies wasn't coincidental, it was a message, a signature, as if the killer wanted to tell us that between the two, only one was truly important. As I faced this contradiction, I wondered, what if the fight wasn't just against the killer, but also against the very condition of existence? After all, we were facing two lives, identical and, at the same time, radically different. And this distinction wasn't just biological, but also narrative. The next step would make this even clearer, as I realized that someone had manipulated the scene to further confuse the investigation. Amidst the scene, amidst the rubble and darkness, objects began to appear that at first glance seemed like valuable clues. A wallet, discarded next to a body, an intact wristwatch, even a carefully folded old photograph. But something wasn't right. The arrangement was almost too artificial, as if they had been left there not by chance, but by a calculating hand. I sifted through each item and realized that some had no proven connection to the victim. Identification documents were too clean to have been at the scene, with no signs of wear or dust, as if they had been planted at the last minute. This set off a red flag. These weren't clues, they were traps. And in all my work, I've learned that nothing confuses an investigator more than the temptation to believe what's too obvious. I remembered an old case where the criminal scattered stolen items to frame an innocent man, and we almost managed to convict the wrong person. The difference is that this time, the scenario seemed much more elaborate. It was as if the perpetrator was playing chess against us, leaving pieces on the board to guide us down a completely wrong path. As the team cataloged each object, I decided to keep in mind a truth that had never betrayed me. False leads only exist because there's something real to hide. And if someone went to so much trouble to manipulate the scene, it was because there was a much darker truth hidden in the shadows. I just needed to be alert enough to see beyond the obvious, and the next discovery would show that the manipulation went far beyond simple objects. It was dawn when I sat alone in my office, with only the photos of the bodies and the reports spread out on my desk. The question that haunted me was simple, but carried a devastating weight. If there was only one missing person report, which of the two was the leftover? And further, what did it mean to be a leftover? I had seen people living under false identities before, but never an enigma that challenged the very notion of existence. This question began to haunt me in a way few cases have, because deep down it wasn't just about criminal investigation, it was also about identity. Who are we without our stories? Without the records that validate us before society? Is a document enough to define who truly lived? Or is it the memories of the people around us that truly make us real? I remembered a conversation I had years ago with a veteran colleague. He said, "John, the greatest mystery isn't who dies, but who's left to tell the story." And in that moment, I realized that perhaps this was the key to understanding the case. Because if one of them was officially recognized and the other wasn't, there was an entire life in silence hidden in the cracks of oblivion. The investigation was no longer just about a crime, but about the very essence of human identity. And the more I thought about it, the clearer it became that the answer lay not just in the bodies, but in the circumstances that allowed even one of them to exist unregistered. And that was precisely what would lead me to the next step in the investigation, where logic would have to be used as a weapon to maintain my reason. In these moments when emotions threaten to take over, there's only one resource capable of maintaining sanity: logic. I took a deep breath and began drawing each piece of this impossible puzzle on the whiteboard in my office. On one side, the DNA tests confirming that both were identical. On the other, the civil records showing only one official identity, and in the background, the shadow of human experiments conducted decades ago. The equation seemed insoluble, but I knew that it was in this apparent chaos that answers often lurk. I traced lines connecting the past with the present, revisited old headlines, compared dates, names, and even fragmented family testimonies. At each point of incoherence, I saw the end of a loose thread, and my instinct told me that if I pulled hard enough, the whole plot would come to light. It wasn't just a criminal investigation. It was almost a philosophical exercise in the human condition. How could two people share the same genetic makeup, but have different life stories? This didn't fit into police manuals or the pages of official science. But I learned that when manuals fail, it's because we're faced with something that hasn't yet been written. It was then that I realized it wasn't enough to look at each element in isolation. The secret lay in uniting the three layers: DNA as evidence of biology, civil records as evidence of society, and the dark past as evidence of the cover-up. Only then would it be possible to make sense of something that seemed illogical. And when this logic began to take shape, I realized I wasn't just facing a crime, but a conspiracy much larger than I'd imagined. As I delved deeper into the investigation, I began to notice cracks in the family's behavior, small contradictions in their statements, prolonged silences when faced with simple questions, exchanged glances that said more than any words could. It wasn't just pain I saw, but the weight of an old secret, carefully hidden for years. And like all secrets, sooner or later it finds a way to surface. In old medical records, I discovered strange entries involving hospitalizations that were never officially reported, mismatched dates, duplicate appointments, and even tests performed under non-existent names. The more I dug, the clearer it became. The family knew something was wrong long before the disappearance was reported. They didn't just suffer from the mystery to some extent, they participated in it. I confronted some relatives with these discoveries, and I saw in their eyes the internal struggle between protecting the victim's memory and revealing a truth too dangerous to speak aloud. It was then that I understood. Perhaps the greatest enemy of the truth was not the killer, but the very silence of those around her. Often, the fear of facing reality creates unwitting accomplices. And this silent conspiracy assured me that the case wasn't just an isolated tragedy. It was the result of years of omission, family pacts, and a tacit agreement that the past would never come to light. But as with any pact made in the dark, the bill always comes due. And I knew that the next revelation would touch on dilemmas far deeper than any ordinary investigation. It was at this point that the investigation ceased to be merely criminal and became a true moral dilemma. If one of those bodies was in fact the result of cloning, how should the law view it? Was it a legitimate person, with full rights, or merely a copy without legal recognition? This question had no answer in the penal codes, nor in the forensic manuals. It was a gray area, where justice was confused with philosophy. I thought about how many times throughout my career I've had to deal with false identities. But this time, it wasn't about falsification, but about existence. The question was, to what extent are we defined by biology? And to what extent by the history we've constructed? If that second being lived, breathed, dreamed, laughed, and suffered, would it be fair to treat it as less human simply because of its unusual origins? These reflections haunted me, because I realized that the investigation wasn't just about them, but about us as well. Who hasn't wondered if they're truly unique? Who can guarantee that our stories couldn't be duplicated or replaced? Suddenly, the case forced me to confront a question no investigator likes to ask. What if the truth is broader than what we can prove? As I reflected on this, I realized this dilemma wasn't just mine. Jurists, doctors, religious leaders, all would be forced to take a stand in the face of an uncomfortable reality. And the more I thought, the more I understood that, behind the deaths, there was a much greater struggle. The fight for the right to exist. But the definitive answer would only come when the best-kept secret was finally revealed. As the final pieces began to fall into place, I realized the truth was closer than it seemed. Amidst hidden documents and fragmented testimonies, a fact emerged that no one had mentioned: the missing man actually had a twin brother. Not a clone, not a being created in a lab, but a real-life brother, hidden from birth by a shadowy agreement between doctors and his own family. The revelation came as a bombshell. I discovered that years ago the family had agreed to separate the twins, giving one of them up for clandestine adoption, as a way to cover up personal scandals and political interests of the time. The pact involved silence, doctored documents, and above all, the denial of an entire life. And now, decades later, the secret was back in the most brutal way possible, with two bodies side by side. This outcome brought forth a mixture of indignation and melancholy. Because in the end, this wasn't about cloning or science fiction, but a human drama marked by cowardly choices. Two brothers who should have shared a life were condemned to exist separated by lies, and when they finally met, it was only in death. But like every mystery, this revelation didn't end the story. On the contrary, it raised even more questions. Who engineered the deal? Who benefited from it? And most importantly, who decided that the truth could only come to light when there was no longer any chance of redemption? I knew there was one final point to be faced, and it would be the most painful of all, accepting that there might never be a clear answer as to who, after all, was the true heir to that identity. Just when it seemed the twins' revelation would close the investigation, a final shadow loomed over me. Because despite all the documents and testimonies, there were still too many unclear points. The DNA, identical in every detail, could be explained by the genetics of identical twins, but the family's silence about the lab's past continued to echo. And I wondered, could the twins' version be just the perfect curtain to hide something even more disturbing? This doubt haunted me because, in certain cases, the official truth is nothing more than a convenient narrative. If powerful interests were involved decades ago, who could guarantee that we weren't simply accepting a comfortable explanation to close the case? And deep down, every time I looked at the photos of the bodies side by side, the feeling that we were facing something bigger wouldn't leave me. I've learned that some investigations don't offer clear endings, but rather half-open doors to theories that defy our understanding. And here was one of them. Were they really just brothers separated by a cruel pact? Or could one of them be the product of the experiments the city insisted on burying? It was a question no one dared answer aloud, but one that throbbed in the minds of everyone involved. And so, even after concluding the investigation, I realized this case would never be over. Because every true mystery never ends. It only transforms into new questions. And in that heavy silence, I left the scene certain that the truth, whatever it may be, was still hidden somewhere, waiting for the right moment to emerge. So after everything you've heard, what do you think really happened? Were they twins separated by a dark secret? Or is there a chance we're dealing with something even more disturbing, like cloning hidden by the family itself? The truth is, in cases like these, every detail can be a clue, and perhaps your interpretation is as valid as any official report. I always say that a good mystery doesn't end with the final clue, but rather when it provokes new question within us. And this case, the case of the two victims, leaves precisely that mark. The feeling that behind the obvious, there is always an invisible layer, waiting to be uncovered. Are we prepared to face this layer? Now I want to hear from you. If you were in my shoes, what line of investigation would you pursue? Would you believe the twins' version or delve deeper into the cloning hypothesis? Write in the comments, because your insight may open up a new perspective we haven't yet explored together. And of course, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and activate the bell, because the next cases will challenge you even more. Each episode is a new opportunity to train your mind, sharpen your logic, and see beyond appearances. After all, true investigation never ends. It just teaches us to see the world through different eyes.